Okay, welcome. My name is Aaron Montgomery, and I'm one of the development and assurance leads at OSRL. I'll be guiding you through this seminar on economic assessment and compensations for marine oil releases. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we will give a high-level overview of this segment of the TPR wheel and a summary of the accompanying good practice guide. This guide is split into 3 sections: impacts of oil on economic activities, liability and compensation, and calculating losses and preparing a claim. The presentation will largely follow the same format, looking at each section in the same order. I've left some time at the end for any questions and answers, but if there are any questions that arise as we go, can I ask that you put these in the chat, and one of the team, my end, will ensure that these are addressed, either by pausing my delivery to ask your question or by holding them for the questions and answer session at the end. So with this in mind, let's take a very short recap on what tier preparedness means. Okay, as the slide states, tier preparedness and response is an internationally recognized planning approach used to define structured levels of response capabilities, plan for appropriate resources to be rapidly mobilized, and enable response escalation for an oil spill of any magnitude. Put simply, it's a planning tool to illustrate what capability is needed in terms of how much and by when. Ultimately, this should be based on assessed risk and consider not just equipment, but also responders and logistical support. Each wedge represents a type of response capability, while each tier represents the capacity of the response capability required to respond to a spill for a specific facility or region. The tiers cannot be defined quantitatively. There are too many complex variables, e.g. Location, weather, local governance, etc. In a spill to calculate the amount and quantity of resources required solely by the volume of oil spilled. The challenge for this segment, economic assessment, claims and compensation, is that there's not really any equipment that's required. The capability is largely in the form of personnel with suitable knowledge. So then let's think what this might look like for a company with both FPSO or shore-based equivalent and some tanker operations. So just as an example, a tier 1 capability in this segment may look like basic in-house knowledge of international regime, key players, applicability of civil liabilities convention, more on that later, the fund convention and supplementary fund, again, more on those later, as well as the good practice guide. A tier 2 capability may be the tier 1 capability plus in-house specialist expertise in maritime law and claims management. And then a tier 3 capability in this segment may look something along the lines of the tier 1 and tier 2 capability plus dedicated training from either the IOPC fund or ITOF, who have expertise in this field in particular, corporate experience of complex claims management, in-depth knowledge of how to apply the relevant schemes and ability to outsource complex claims management. So it's a tricky one to really apply the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 model to this, but nonetheless, it provides us a good structure and framework to think about how we would build that capability in terms of company knowledge. Okay, so this is just an example, and for each company scenario, risk, needs, it's all going to be different. So let's get into this a little more. What are all of these regimes that we talked about, the conventions, the funds, and what does this mean in broader terms? So let's start by exploring the impacts of oil on economic activities. Okay, the marine environment can be impacted by a release of oil, with human activities that rely on seawater and coastal areas affected directly by the oil and indirectly either through cleanup activities or by imposed restrictions. Let's dive straight into a bit of participant engagement with a question. What comes into your mind when you think of fishing and mariculture? Take a moment and share your thoughts in the chat comments in the chat bar in the side. So we'll take a moment there and see if anything comes through in the chat. What comes into your mind when you think of fishing and mariculture? Salmon farms. Thank you, Tim. Thanks for not leaving me hanging there. Okay. The colossals of fishermen, reputation. Okay. Okay. A few things coming through there. Good stuff. Okay, as you've all rightly identified, fishing activities can take various forms. Right. There we go. We could be looking at impacts to catching wild fish populations caught via trawling, purse seine fishing, or other similar methods. We would also need to consider impacts to mariculture, which includes fish, mollusk, and seaweed raised and collected from farms. So this salmon farming that Tim alluded to. These farms could take the shape of large nets, such as those shown here, rope strings for seaweed or mussels, or racks for oysters. There's many different forms that these can take. Consideration of impacts on fishing also needs to be given to subsistence fishing, in which communities fish for the primary purpose of domestic consumption, with any excess going to local markets. And this can certainly be a challenging area for assessing the extent of claims. Furthermore, we also need to consider not just the fishermen themselves, but the impact on the broader chain of supply. Impacts to fishing activities will have a knock-on impacts to processing companies, ship chandlers, all the way through to restaurants that supply customers. The extent to which a business is impacted will largely be dependent, in part, to the proximity to the geographically impacted area. So you'll get this theme running throughout the rest of the session, the kind of geographical and business remoteness, and we'll revisit that term as we get further through. The extent of impact on each of these respective areas will be dependent on a wide number of factors. These can range from the properties of oil itself and its propensity for physical and chemical interaction, through to weather conditions and seasonal variations such as spawning periods. Knowledge of these different factors will determine our understanding of the range and extent of potential damages. These damages may include physical contamination, such as smothering, or toxicological effects, such as fish taint. This fish taint is where the ingestion of oil particles results in a noticeable smell or taste in the end product. It may also include the disruption to recreational and commercial activities, such as fishery closures. These potential damages will in turn drive some of the broader response measures. So let's touch upon some of those broader response measures. These response measures may take the form of protection, collection, and removal of oil from the environment through to bans on fishing activities. It should be noted that measures taken to combat a release of oil may also have an impact on seafood. For example, aggressive or inappropriate response techniques, such as indiscriminate shoreline cleaning with high pressure or hot water, may adversely affect some species. And there are a number of other examples that we can give of improper use of response techniques that may in fact do more harm to the environment than good. So this is something we need to be really conscious of. Furthermore, when considering the impact of bans on fishing activities, consideration should be given to the consequences of other events, such as natural fluctuations in fish stocks. So there's going to be a seasonal impact on either fish where they migrate, spawning seasons, and so on. Variation in fishing effort, including overfishing. So is that area prone to overfishing or underfishing in certain species or sensitive marker species? Climatic effects such as El Nino and La Nina, of which we're seeing those taking place in the Pacific at the moment. And contamination from industrial and urban runoff. In short, there are a wide range of potential impacts and an even wider range of contributing factors to the range and extent of those impacts. This is why it is valuable to pre-identify likely impacts through contingency planning and to ensure those resources at risk are included in any net environmental benefit analysis and in the completion of any accompanying spill impact mitigation assessments. In a perfect world, this is going to be done in close collaboration with key environmental and economic stakeholders, such as commercial fishermen and national and regional licensing bodies. In practice, that can be trickier than it sounds there. Certainly that stakeholder engagement plays a key part there. Just looking through the comments as well, very briefly there. Yeah, correct pick up there as well with impact on turtle population and hatching places. Definitely something we'd want to consider in terms of the broader environmental impacts beyond fishing and mariculture. Okay, so let's keep this going and look at a brief case study. And for this, I'm going to use the one from the Good Practice Guide, which is the Brer. So the Brer tanker lost power and grounded on the southern point of the Shetland Islands in the UK. It released approximately 85,000 tons of Gulf Axe crude oil, which is a kind of light to medium crude oil. Crude oil comes in many different forms, with this particular cargo, as mentioned, being light in nature. This, combined with the exceptionally strong wind and wave energy that ultimately resulted in the incident in the first place, naturally mechanically dispersed a significant part of the oil into the water column. Subsequent subsurface currents spread that oil over a wide area. Now, to avoid the risk of contaminated fish and shellfish entering the food chain, a fisheries exclusion zone was imposed, with monitoring of seafood commencing immediately after the incident. The primary concern centered on commercially important salmon and mariculture industry. Whilst no fish mortality was observed, testing for aromatic oil contamination, so that's benzenes and naphthalines, showed that approximately 20% of the salmon farms in Shetland close to the incident were contaminated, with stock tainted by naturally dispersed oil. Harvesting of mature salmon stock in the affected area for onward sale was suspended. Importantly, the seafood testing allowed continued marketing of uncontaminated stock by unaffected salmon farms. Concentrations of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, in fish tissues declined gradually once clean water conditions returned, a process called depuration. Nevertheless, depuration of mature fish was not completed in time for sale, and remaining stock of mature fish, approximately 1,700 tons, was removed and destroyed. Younger fish, due to be harvested the following year, were expected to be depurated in time for sale, but the local authorities maintained the harvesting ban, and a further 3,500 tons of fish were destroyed. Fresh smolt were introduced to the affected farms in the spring and were harvested successfully 2 years later. So smolt, think young salmon. So a large number of local fishing vessels were engaged in the monitoring of wild fish stocks. Fish caught inside the initial exclusion zone were found to be contaminated, but at lower levels than recorded by the farmed salmon. Nevertheless, the initial exclusion zone was extended after 2 weeks to encompass an additional area in which contaminated fish had been caught. The exclusion zone for wild finfish species was lifted after 3 months in April 1993 on the basis of monitoring results. The initial fisheries exclusion zone was extended to include a supplementary area of shellfish. Crustaceans and mollusks were detected to be initially more contaminated than wild fish due to their intimate contact with oil sediment and to their slower rate of depuration. Now, compensation for the cleanup and pollution damage resulting from the Brer incident was provided by Shipowners P&I Club and under the 1969 Civil Liabilities Convention and by the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund. More on these later. So moving on and moving away from fishing and mariculture, we understand that fishing and mariculture are vulnerable to the impact of marine oil spills, but there are also other sectors we need to consider. One such area is tourism. This is a broad term, but essentially includes businesses such as hotels, restaurants, attractions, water sports, etc. These can be affected by oil on the water's surface or on the shore. Much depends on the extent to which the businesses are dependent on the coastline affected and their proximity to the impacted area. So again, we've got that kind of term remoteness. How close to the impacted area are they? It's also worth considering that once a shoreline is clean, normal activity can resume, although media attention may have caused damage to the local image by denting consumer confidence in the area. Beyond tourism, we also need to consider industry, with seawater is widely used in a broad range of industries as a coolant for thermal and nuclear power stations and refineries. In addition, desalination plants and numerous others use seawater and rely on the ability to draw clean water from the sea. Occasionally, following an oil spill, water intakes may be shut down as a precaution against damage to machinery and to avoid more extensive shutdown of the entire plant. So this is something else that we need to consider in the kind of broader spheres of claims and compensation. Vessels may be affected by oil within a port, harbour or marina, or when on the open sea. Contamination may be limited to a band of oil around the hull, or it may be more extensive if the vessel has been involved in cleanup activities. Or it can be more of a challenge indeed if the oil is taken into the engine's cooling system. This list of potential impacts and impacted industries is very long and ultimately dependent on the location of the incident itself and of the surrounding industries. So all of this will need to be considered where possible during early stages of the response, or even better in any planning process that will have been done through oil spill contingency plans and alike prior to an incident taking place. So what can be done to help mitigate these impacts? I pause there to let your mind think on this. The chances are many of you will have naturally gravitated to the various response techniques that can be applied to reduce the impact of any oil spill. Booms and skimmers being particular popular options there. or indeed in some instances shoreline cleanup. And you're not wrong. However, to allow this to happen, the IMO and various states around the world identified the need to ensure that money to pay for said cleanup would be available at an early stage to allow prompt and quick response to this. Essentially, what we're talking about here is if we had to wait for the legal process to determine who was responsible and who was going to pay for the cleanup, then it may be a very lengthy delay before we saw any cleanup activities take place. So the international regimes, IMO primarily here, along with the P&I clubs, put in processes in place to allow early release of funds to pay for cleanup activities and allow remediation to take place at as early a stage as possible. Okay, so let's talk about some of the liability and compensation. Through the late 60s and 70s, there were a number of large oil spills that prompted the development of international conventions to support funding and response. These conventions followed a defined process of signature, ratification, and acceptance, approval and accession through the IMO, before coming into force in a country and becoming binding upon that government. So in short, once things get signed off by a nation at the IMO, that country will then need to go away and ratify that into their national law. A good example of this is from a UK perspective. Much of this is contained within the UK Merchant Shipping Act. And in your respective nations, you will have had many of these conventions adopted within national regulations and national conventions there. So what conventions are we interested in? For the purposes of this session, we'll focus on the main international mechanisms. It's important to note that there are a number of important pieces of legislation that are purely national, such as OPA 90 in the USA, the Ship Source Oil Pollution Fund in Canada, and the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund in China. However, for our purposes, I'm going to focus on the internationally adopted mechanisms. Okay, so let's address these in broad terms to start with. If we have a look at the first level of protection that we've got here, you can see in the left-hand box, we have the Civil Liability Convention. This is the compensation regime that we're talking about. It's the international legislation that then gets adopted by the various nation states and written into their national laws. And the way that this works is by the tanker owners, who are strictly liable, and I'll touch upon that in a second again. They purchase insurance through P&I clubs, and the P&I clubs, as effectively the insurers here, will then pay claims and compensations that meet the requirement of the international conventions. And they will do so with a lot of support and guidance from really good organizations in the form of ITOF and IOPC. So a bit more on the Civil Liability Convention. This governs the liability of ship owners for oil pollution damage. Under this convention, the registered ship owner has strict liability for pollution damage caused by the escape or discharge of persistent oil from the ship. And that's an important point, that the oil is persistent. It means it's going to hang around in the environment for some time. There's a bit more detail and science behind what is persistent and what is non-persistent. But for today's purposes, think about it in terms of it's going to persist in the environment for an extended period of time if we don't do something to support the cleanup activities here. So the strict liability, it means that even in the absence of fault, that the ship owner will assume liability for this, and the P&I club will, the mechanisms will start, and claims can be submitted, and the P&I clubs can then work on working through those claims to see if they meet all of the various requirements. So the ship, it is also worthy of note that the ship owner will be exempt from liability only if they can prove that the damage resulted from an act of war, hostility, civil war, insurrection, or natural phenomena, or of an exceptional, inevitable, and irresistible character. So a bit of legal terminology there. Essentially, take the first part away there. The ship owner is exempt from liability if the damage resulted from an act of war. He is also exempt if the damage was wholly caused by an act or omission done with the intent to cause damage by a third party, or if the damage was wholly caused by the negligence or other wrongful act of any government or other authority responsible for the maintenance of lights or other navigational aids. So essentially, if they are coming into a port and that government and the local body that looks after the navigational aids hasn't done their job and the vessel runs aground and has an oil spill, the ship owner is exempt because of that final point there, that the damage was wholly caused by the negligence or other wrongful, just as an example. So a brief touch upon the Civil Liability Convention there. Key takeaways there: ship owners need to have insurance for this. The P&I clubs will work through the claims, and that's because the ship owner is strictly liable. Let's move on to the next two tiers because we can address these broadly together. So we can see this on the left-hand side. We've got this, the fund convention and the supplementary fund. We'll start with the fund convention. This was so the 92 fund convention, which is supplementary to the 92 civil liabilities convention, establishes a regime for compensating victims when compensation under the CLC, Civil Liabilities Convention, is not available or not enough. So under certain circumstances, if we run out of funds at this level, there are funds available at the next level up to keep paying for this. So the fund convention pays compensation when the damage exceeds the limit of the ship owner's liability under the Civil Liabilities Convention, as I've just mentioned. The ship owner is exempt from liability under the 1992 Civil Liability Convention. So we talked about a few of those reasons why they might be exempt: acts of war, negligence of the local authorities to keep navigational marks together, or the ship owner is financially incapable of meeting their obligation under the CLC, Civil Liabilities Convention, and insurance is insufficient to pay valid compensation. So essentially, if we run out of money here, if that country, if your respective country has signed up to this fund convention, additional compensation for cleanup and fishing and industry may be available. Now, if your country is signed up to the supplementary fund, and these are all funded, as you can see, by levies on oil receivers in those member states. So if you're a net importer of oil, you will then contribute to this international fund. If your nation state has signed up to it. The supplementary fund provides an additional compensation beyond the amount under the 92 Convention. Fund member states, which are also parties to the protocol, annual contributions to the supplementary fund are made on a basis as contributions to the 92 fund. Effectively, these two layers work in the same way. Levies on oil receivers in the member states. So let's keep going, because, you know, whilst this is all very well for commercial for commercial tankers, commercial non-tankers or fixed oil offshore assets are going to be of concern. But fear not, there's some things in place there. So the success of the Civil Liability Convention and fund conventions to pay compensation for oil spill cleanup led to the introduction of the Bunkers Convention. The Bunkers Convention is a single-tier compensation system that is modelled on the Civil Liabilities Convention. So effectively, you have countries sign up to the Bunkers Convention, ship owners will have insurance with P&I clubs, and the P&I clubs will pay out for those claims against the criteria which is defined in the Bunkers Convention. And again, they'll be supported by companies such as the IOPC or ITOF. I won't be able to go into that in any more depth at this point in time, but in terms of what you need to know, it works like the Civil Liabilities Convention. For offshore operators, there's not a huge amount. Something called OPOL exists. OPOL is a voluntary agreement under which participating companies accept strict liability, with some exceptions. Up to a maximum of 250 million US dollars are available per incident, comprising of 125 million to cover claims for pollution damage and 125 million for cleanup or remedial measures. Claims for damage exclude damage caused to the facility, so we're not going to pay for the FPSO or for the rig. As part of the agreement, operators must provide evidence of their ability to pay claims. So for this to happen, what they will typically do is oil producers who sign up to this will purchase insurance or self-insure, show that they can provide that 250 million, and then they get a certificate back to show that they meet the requirements of this system. But it's worth noting that this system only operates in the North Sea at the moment. So there's no other kind of scheme really other than national schemes which may pick up oil pollution compensation from fixed assets such as drilling platforms. So in terms of calculating loss, we're getting towards the back end of this session now, and the key takeaways that I'd like you to pick up on are really think of the remoteness and the reasonableness behind a claim. So anytime you may be submitting an oil spill response claim, think about how reasonable the actions were and how remote those activities were to the impacts of the oil spill. So the aim of compensation is to place the injured party in a position as close as possible to that prior to the incident. To enable this, claims may be submitted for a number of categories of costs and losses. So response claims, these are termed cleanup and prevention measures under the international conventions. This type of claim includes costs for response operations at sea, work to protect sensitive areas from contamination, and cleanup of affected shorelines and wildlife. This is what we tend to think of in terms of claims and compensation. Property damage. This includes the cost to clean, repair, or replace oiled property, and that could be physical property in terms of ownership, or property in terms of actual property, hotels, housing, etc., etc. Economic loss, this includes losses incurred as a result of released oil, either as a consequence of contaminated property or other reasons. And environmental damage, work undertaken to monitor and accelerate the natural recovery of damaged area may be admissible under the International Convention. So this may be remediation of mangrove areas or seagrass areas or coral reef. There could be claims and compensation available for that. Now, in preparing a claim, good information is key. The type of information required to support claims for costs arising from the above categories is described in the IOPC Funds Claims book, and there's a link to this that we'll provide at the end. An example of the type of information that they're looking for will be shown in that claims manual. For many, this is tricky because a lot of people in organizations simply don't know what is technically reasonable. To determine if it's reasonable, there are a few approaches that may help. The first would be to use good practice guides. These guides are touched upon in these TPR seminars, and they act as a good handrail to guide you in response. However, the chances are most people have either not read the good practice guides, and it's unrealistic to expect them to read them at the time of an incident. So the next step would be to seek guidance and technical support in response by a reputable oil spill response organisation who's familiar with good practice. That could be Oil Spill Response Limited or others. I would also recommend reaching out to ITOF. ITOF are very experienced in working closely with the P&I clubs on response guidance and claims handling, have a wealth of practical experience over many years in this area. We were very lucky to have Tim Wadsworth on the call with us for a while. Tim actually wrote the Good Practice Guide and is a member of ITOF. The second big takeaway to remember is remoteness. This is the most relevant when considering economic loss. So the IOPC funds guidelines state that the claimant must be able to show that the financial loss has been suffered due to pollution, that the loss has a direct link to the contamination due to oil, and that the loss can be measured financially. In determining whether a claim is admissible, it's prudent to consider a number of factors, including the geographic proximity, so again, remoteness, of the claimant's business activity to the contaminated area, the degree to which a claimant's business is economically dependent on an affected resource, how economically remote they are from the impacts of the spill, and the extent to which a claimant has had alternative sources of supply and business opportunities, and the extent to which a claimant's business forms an integral part of the economic activity within the overall area affected by the oil spill. So again, two big takeaways: how reasonable were the efforts of the person submitting the claim, either to protect their areas or in their cleanup activities, how reasonable was that? And how remote were they? So let's finish, final slides here, with a quick activity. So just put in the chat boxes here. I'll give you some scenarios here and we'll work through certainly the top three. So the first scenario in the top left is economic claim for the use of sorbent pads at sea, thrown out onto the sea to absorb the oil. Do you think that is reasonable or unreasonable in terms of their approach? Pop it in the chat, reasonable or unreasonable. Okay, not seeing too much in the chat. There we go, unreasonable. Alex Leonard, thank you very much. Good, sir, and good to see you on board. Indeed correct, and good to see you getting it right. So yeah, Alex is right. this would be unreasonable if a person or organization was at sea just dishing out sorbent pads. This would be unreasonable from a technical perspective because those pads would cause more environmental damage than good, because they would just float off and it'd be very hard to contain those. So we would deem this unreasonable and the claim wouldn't be paid. The next short scenario we've got is the hotel in the background of the second picture there has a loss of revenue, and they're claiming for that loss of revenue. It's pure economic loss, and there's no damage to the physical property. So it's just people not attending that hotel because there's oil on the beach outside. Is that reasonable or unreasonable? I'll give you a moment to ponder that and then pop your responses in the chat. Thank you again, Alex. And again, you're all over this. It is indeed reasonable. Yep, the claims would be provided. Reasonable if proven that attendance is lower. Yes. And again, it's all about providing evidence here. So they would look at the level of attendance in that particular hotel pre-oil spill, during the period of the oil spill, and potentially post-oil spill, and look at the differences there and pay out accordingly for what's claimed. For the purposes of time, as I've run over a bit, I shall move on and point you towards a few bits of further reading. So there's the tiered preparedness and response scan glance material, TPR good practice guides, and I'll also steer you towards the IOPC Fund website and the ITOF website, both of which provide some fantastic information on economic assessment and claims and compensation. At this point, I will hang around if there are any questions. Please either open up your mics and ask away, or pop them in the chat. If there are no questions, I'll just steer you towards the next seminar that we'll be doing, which will be on environmental impact assessment. This will take place on January the 11th. So I'll thank you all for attending, and thank you for your engagement and your responses. I'll hang on a bit longer just in case there are any questions. Okay, right, Dario. Question there. Thank you very much. Some words about NEBA. So NEBA stands for Net Environmental Benefit Analysis. In simplistic terms, what we're looking at here is when we think about a response activity, by commencing that response activity, is that going to provide a net improvement to the current situation, or if by doing a certain response activity, may we cause more damage than we reduce? So as well, all good response organizations should be continually asking themselves that question throughout a response. By doing this, what's going to be the net impact? And by doing this activity, am I going to improve the situation, or am I going to potentially cause more harm? Constantly weighing up those balances. There are a lot of factors that play into this and need considering, because what may benefit one area may impact another. So you're looking at all these different activities and all of the different impacts, and at times that's really difficult, kind of weighing up, do we do an activity which results in, you know, impact to oil upon the shoreline to protect offshore fisheries, or do we protect offshore fisheries and, you know, and impact the shoreline and vice versa? That is always best done in dialogue with as many stakeholders as possible. In practice, that can be really difficult. So we've got a number of tools that help us along the way, and I'd steer you towards the good practice guides around net environmental benefit analysis, and in particular, the methodology on spill impact mitigation assessment, which really give you a step-by-step guide on how to complete that thought process that I described in very simplistic terms there. But it's a wonderful tool once you get it working, and very important to weighing up how we want to respond to make sure we do the most benefit to the area and cause as least harm as possible. Great question though, and great nudge. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more. Okay, how to consider the economic costs of no response actions. That's an interesting one. How to consider the economic cost of no response actions. Okay, so the best tool I would apply in this is when we think about NEBA, and I'll break this down step by step very quickly, as you've asked a great question there. We can break NEBA down into 4 sections. So predicting the outcomes. In this first part, predicting outcomes, what we're really looking at is what's going to happen if we don't do anything. So what we can do is we can look at impacts upon a wide number of shorelines and economic and environmental sensitivities, and we weigh up what's going to happen if we don't do anything, and then we can work through what happens when we apply certain response techniques, and we can see what impacts, or, you know, positive or negative, we would have on each of those respective areas. So by looking at that, we can then start to build up the appropriateness of doing something, or indeed, as you've alluded to in this case, not doing something. There may be some instances, and a good example may be a light oil which is going to naturally disperse of its own accord due to high winds and turbulent wave conditions, that there's actually no technical benefit to us going out and assisting that, because nature is going to do the best response itself. However, there may be impacts still from that, which claims and compensation could then be submitted against. But yeah, these are all factors that we think about when we build up the overall response strategy. If there's more you'd like to know on this, Dario, I'd be more than happy to set up a call and talk through your questions around this area in more detail. But hopefully for you, those of you that have stayed, that's provided a bit more insight to oil spill response as a broader subject matter area. And net environmental benefit analysis is something I would strongly advocate. So do seek out the good practice guide if you have time, or even better, check out the TPR seminar done on this session. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we'll draw this to a close. Again, thank you all for attending, and we'll look to end the call shortly.